Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this French lecture series. We're very fortunate to have a French lecture series that is now 21 years old. It started in 1999, and we've hosted alumni, scholars, journalists, movie makers, colleagues, artists, and tonight we have the pleasure of welcoming back to Macalester Nolin Deloison Baum, who has an interesting trajectory after Mac. And I will let my colleague Andrew Pilling, who is in charge of organizing the French lecture series this year, introduce him. But I just wanted to say hi to Nolin because I had the pleasure of having him come and speak to my class about 3 times already. So welcome back. And thank you for being here tonight, everyone.
Ok, merci Joël. Bonsoir tout le monde. Welcome again. I'd like to also extend our warm welcome to everyone, and thanks to Nolin. Nolin was one of the first students that I had when I arrived at Macalester, which I think was 2008 or 2009. Maybe I don't know what was your first year. I guess you started in 2008, Nolin. So because you graduated in 2012, is that right? So yeah, and I believe Nolin took many classes with us in our department, many more than he needed to complete a French major. I remember some of our class discussions very clearly right now. So it's a real pleasure to see you again, Nolin, and to be able to introduce you tonight and listen to your talk. And I'm not actually going to present your biography in detail because you're going to present some of that yourself in your talk, but I will just mention the title. So Auguste Escoffier, Master Chef and Social Innovator. So thank you again, Nolin. And after your presentation, we'll have some time for questions, and then conclude around 6 o'clock. So thank you, everyone. Bienvenue, and so it's all yours, Nolin.
Great, thank you. It's good to be back. I'm going to do a screen share real quick, and I will tell you a little bit about myself as soon as I get that set up. I thought I should introduce myself. I'm Nolin. I graduated from Macalester, and after I graduated from Macalester, I went to cooking school in Paris at Le Cordon Bleu. And since then, I've cooked in the United States, Italy, France, and Finland. I'm also a lifelong collector of rare books. It's kind of always been a hobby, and more recently, cookbooks. This is necessary information because it helps understand how I became interested in Auguste Escoffier, our topic today. In walking you through the timeline of the story of how I learned about the man's life, I think everything that I'll be telling you will fall into a coherent narrative. I'm going to try to supplement this narrative with images, mostly of things in my collection. So when I was asked to do this presentation, I asked myself, who cares? Why do I care about someone who lived over 100 years ago in a different country? And as a cook, the answer is kind of obvious. It presents itself. When you work in kitchens, you hear a lot of stories about famous cooks, Anthony Bourdain, Julia Child, the list is long. But inevitably, one name will come up, and it's the name of the most revered cook, and it's Auguste Escoffier. When you ask most cooks to tell you why they revere him so, they don't have a whole lot of depth in their information, typically. They know he's important, and they tell you that he revolutionized French cuisine, and that he was instrumental in making it as revered as it is. But they don't really know any details. They tell you that he was a master chef. They tell you that he was a celebrity chef. And for me, that's more or less saying that he's important because he's important, which I find kind of frustrating. So what did I do? I went to Wikipedia, just like any good student. And what I found there was a blow-by-blow list, a mile long, of his culinary accomplishments, which are astonishing. They really are. And I'd encourage you to read the Wikipedia page. It's excellent. It's a brief list of facts, and they're all good. So what I did glean is that he elevated the status of chefs in the public's eye and reinvented the way food was served and how kitchens were organized. the status of the profession of one that is respected and considered an art, the systems that are now in place in professional kitchens are largely thanks to him. And I'll get into specifics about that later. So there's a lot of kitchen lore about the man. He's revered. The thing about Escoffier that treats him as something of a deity is that most of the stories are verifiable. His reputation as a cook doesn't need any exaggerating. And to this day, he's still referred to many French cooks as Maître Escoffier or Master Teacher Escoffier. Many of his contemporaries lovingly referred to him as Papa, or Dad. And during his 50-year career, he oversaw and mentored 2,000 cooks. And to this day, there's an international organization of French chefs, the best ones, called Les Disciples d'Escoffier, or the Disciples of Escoffier. There's also a group for women called Les Dames d'Escoffier, for female chefs, that's affiliated with the larger group. So after my internet research, I decided to seek out some books on the man. And what I discovered is that most of the books read exactly like the Wikipedia page. They're just chronological lists of all of his feats and accomplishments. And it's, dauntingly long, but there's no real analysis. So I'm going to start with a few of these accomplishments, the kind of cursory list, some of my favorite things to talk about, and what's traditionally talked about. But what I would like to do is to try to weave them into the context of who he was, what his philosophy about life was, and the story of his raised awareness and social consciousness. His political ideas and quiet activism was extraordinarily ahead of its day. Many chefs model their cuisine on his, but not that many realize that his cuisine launched the notion to many chefs being able to leverage their celebrity to affect social change. You're not going to find out about this online, and probably not even in the library. So as a cook, I was, completely fascinated by this man at this point, and I was struggling to figure out what it was that drove him, why he was so accomplished. It seemed like something was missing, and I was kind of interested in finding out what. The thing is that, he was writing over 100 years ago, and people were writing about him over 100 years ago, and a lot of his texts aren't widely available anymore. The main ones are, but the kind of more nitty-gritty ones aren't. But as I mentioned, I'm a book collector, so this was, it was a challenge that I actually was up for. I wanted to locate some more texts and learn more about him. So that's how I started really getting into collecting material about him. I'd read some of the in-print texts, and I was after some of the out-of-print ones. I, was also interested in maybe acquiring some unusual, rare ones. So this is a great example of what I mean by that. This is a book that I acquired that's one of only 254 copies ever printed, and who knows how many even survived. The text for it isn't available anywhere online, and you'll find it in a few libraries in other countries mostly, and it's unusual. It's his first book, and it's not a cookbook. It's a book about decorative wax flowers. He, as a child, had dreamt of actually being a sculptor, and this was sort of a way to meet that need. Later in his adult life, in his spare time, he made decorative wax flowers, which sometimes he'd use to decorate his dishes, but this was really just a passion project of his, and that's an aspect of his life that I was able to learn about that you really can't get anywhere else but a rare bookstore. It's also really important because in its introduction, he discusses his views on plating and the aesthetics of food, and you can't read this anywhere else. And as I got more interested in his life, I became more and more interested in tracking down original handwriting of his, things that were definitely never seen before or hadn't been seen in 100 years. This is an example of a postcard that he wrote to a friend of his, suggesting that his friend should save money by buying directly from the publisher rather than having him mail him a copy of his brand new cookbook. So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about the history that you would initially learn when you're reading about Escoffier, maybe online. It's necessary to understand what I'd like to talk about afterwards, and it's quite remarkable, and I think it's interesting, but maybe not universally appealing or interesting. They're anecdotes mostly about who he was and what he was best known for. But they interest me because I'm a French trained cook. For cooks, he remains influential in their day-to-day. And, maybe you'll find it interesting because you've chosen to be students of French language and culture, or maybe you just like to eat in restaurants, and learning about how he influenced restaurants is important to you. What I can promise you, though, is that you'll find some of the details of his philosophy interesting. And that's kind of stuff that I find the most compelling about him, outside of his culinary career, which he's known for. If I could use one adjective to describe him, it would be modern. He was known for his modernization while maintaining a healthy reverence for the past. These are two cookbooks from the century that he was born, and they are illustrated with pictures of the food from that century and the centuries before. What do I mean by that? Banquet-style food, heavily decorated, ostentatious, heavy on sauces, and probably not something that you would really want to eat these days, because it was usually cold by the time that you got to it, because they'd spent so much time decorating it, and because all the food was brought at the same time. There was an expression at the time, la sauce fait passer le poisson, sauce makes fish passable, if you will. The fish usually wasn't very fresh, and having a heavy sauce to cover the flavor was better than tasting the fish itself. He, was not a fan of this idea and did away with heavy sauces. He felt that sauces should enhance the product that you were featuring, rather than masking it. And this is, something that we still do today as cooks. It doesn't sound all that revolutionary, but trust me, if you've ever eaten bad fish, you don't want to. And the other thing that he did was he got rid of banquet-style food. Largely, he was responsible for this. He did love decorative stuff, but he felt that it detracted from the actual quality of the food, and preferred to have good food, good tasting food, rather than heavily decorated food. He was the first French chef to do away with decorations that couldn't be eaten, that were not comestible. So by the time that Escoffier died in 1935, banquet-style food was something of the past. Unless you were Dali, here he is eating in 1973, the year that his cookbook was published. He's eating a tour d'argent, one of the last holdouts of this kind of crazy decorative food. And Dali loved this kind of food because it was outrageous and completely unseen by a whole generation of people in Europe at this point. By the time that Escoffier died, meals were coursed and served. Each course was served one at a time, so every plate was done in the best way possible. Escoffier also invented the à la carte menu. So that's to say, you could read the menu and choose what you wanted. There were options, and this is something that most people can't imagine not having in a restaurant today. This is another page from Dali's cookbook, and if everything here looks unfamiliar to you, it's largely thanks to Escoffier and how he changed the style of food that we eat today. In order to accomplish this complicated change in his style of cuisine, he also had to reorganize how his kitchen was run, specifically his kitchen's hierarchy. So he's also known for the way that cooks respond up a chain of command, and how food is delegated out. So one plate that you eat might be cooked by a number of different people, and that's to kind of maximize efficiency in the kitchen, so that you wind up with a plate that is made quickly and really well. So he reorganized his kitchen kind of in a hierarchy that might look like a military hierarchy, uh, and also organized kind of an assembly line style of food, like a Henry Ford Industrial Revolution sort of a way of creating food. And this was all quite new at this time. So he was always looking for a way to increase efficiency in his kitchens. That didn't mean cutting corners, quite the opposite. It meant finding new solutions to old problems. A great example of that is, he looked to make things more ergonomic for his cooks, more usable, more straightforward. In previous generations, cooks were known for drinking light beer all day to stay hydrated, and he decided that this maybe wasn't such a great idea, because by the end of the day, his cooks were dehydrated and, more or less drunk. And so he suggested that his cooks stop doing this. This was really early in his career, and offered them flavored water. He was also known for never raising his voice, which is, to this day, not something that you can always expect when you work in a professional kitchen. Why did he do this? Well, a lot of people say that it was just because he found that it fostered better relations with his cooks, and went to the greater goal of having food made really well, efficiently and quietly, with no strife. As I mentioned, he didn't like not fresh fish, and that's something that was possible because the standards of hygiene in kitchens was increased under him. This was, the era of Louis Pasteur and the scientific understanding of the quality of produce and medical times that understood the relationship between diet and health. So you almost might say that he's the first chef dietitian, but really he was just interested in serving the best possible product. And to do that, he sought out the freshest and the most seasonal food. It's not really an astonishing fact to us, but it was unusual at the time, and it's thanks to him and the advances in science and our understanding of science's relationship with food that we have the fresh food that we have today. And he was one of the early adopters to understanding this. As early as 1874, he writes, "It occurred to me that one might go further in introducing a product which could replace fresh tomatoes at any season." So early in the next century, he was responsible for creating the first commercial canned tomatoes, and this was so that he could have excellent tomatoes year round and use them in his kitchens. So it's thanks to him that canned tomatoes exist. So Escoffier wrote prolifically, which was not always something that was a given for cooks at this time. Not all cooks were even literate. But he wrote prolifically and had already contributed quite a bit to gastronomic literature in gastronomic journals throughout his life. But his magnum opus is called Le Guide Culinaire, and it was published in 1903, and it's probably the most influential tome ever written on French cuisine. It's not really debatable. What is subject to debate, though, is the originality of the information within it. How much of it was of his own creation, and how much of it was, taken from other people. He never made it a secret that he was indebted to his predecessors, and This was his attempt to kind of cohesively assemble and streamline all of his predecessors' knowledge, and then to add in a few innovations of his own. Nevertheless, it's been heavily debated how much of the authorship was even his, which is kind of preposterous. Many have suggested that he, known for his humility, was generous in crediting his co-authors as co-authors was, maybe generous. Perhaps it would have been more appropriate to list them as mere contributors. So I was intrigued by this, and this is my own copy of Le Guide Culinaire. It's the first thing that I ever acquired that has his handwriting in it. And it's dedicated to one of his co-authors. And it kind of hints at what kind of a person he was behind closed doors. The inscription that you can see here reads, to my very dear friend and devoted collaborator, Émile Fétu, in recognition of my eternal gratitude. This was kind of an astonishing discovery because it really suggested that Émile Fétu had been a major contributor and indeed a worthy co-author for this book. This really kind of whetted my appetite to discover more things about him that, could be documented, made me want to go find more information about him. The existence of this book with this inscription to his co-author wasn't known before I found it, and it's sort of answered a mystery that has lasted for quite some time. Not conclusively, but it certainly strongly suggests that Escoffier felt that his co-authors were genuinely co-authors. And it kind of made me curious about, what else was not known about his life. So it's often mentioned that Escoffier was considered the first celebrity chef, and that was probably because he interacted with his customers. He would come out and talk to them, make sure that they had enjoyed their meal, and see if he could, improve it. This is a menu that he wrote where he dedicated some of his dishes to his clients. Peaches Melba is a really famous example of this, and it was named after Nellie Melba, the famous opera singer of the era, and he made a habit of creating eponymous dishes, and more often than not, these dishes were named after women. So it's said that he had a great amount of reverence for women, and others have said that this was probably just because it was good business practice. Who knows? What's certain is that he encouraged women to not be ashamed of eating unaccompanied by men, first in Paris and then in kind of Elizabethan England, where, women were not supposed to be seen in public not accompanied by a man. So it might not sound crazy today that women might dine alone, but back then it was. And it was effectively Escoffier and his business partner, Caesar Ritz, of the Ritz-Carlton hotels, who campaigned to be allowed to serve meals on Sundays and who lobbied for women to be allowed to dine out when they wished and without the company of a man. I find that, astonishing. So were these men driven only by their business acumen? I kind of want to start to suggest that no, maybe not. Maybe it had something to do with who they were as humans. So I kind of just suggested it, but maybe there was a bigger picture than just a cook who wanted to establish commercial success. What drove him? And one of the hardest texts for me to get my hands on was a pamphlet that was called The Project for Mutual Aid in the Extinction of Pauperism. Fortunately, there's a obscure partial translation that was published. It's now out of print. And I've copied here a few quotations from that translation. And frankly, I was floored when I found these translations. So in the first one, he writes, "I have been too close a spectator of the sufferings of the poor not to have drawn some useful conclusions. The majority of socialist theories, even the most exaggerated, rest on an undeniably just basis." And then he goes on to talk about unifying Europe, writing, "Why then should we Europeans not unite to form one great country? In the not too distant future, this vision will become reality, but probably not until mankind has undergone the most assured and most fearful of wars." This was well before World War II, but he was fearful that war was coming along. Furthermore, he says, "A country that assigns more than 1,000 million pounds annually to its military and naval forces should logically be able to provide a tranquil and carefree old age for all its people." And so for me, this text really helped things fall into place. It succinctly told me about his philosophy and how his philosophy had developed. He appears to have really developed a social awareness at some point, and kind of everything started to fall into place. What he cared about was humans. This aspect of his life is virtually unknown to most histories that have been written about him. And it's really too bad because it really kind of explains a lot of the other things in his life. When you think about canned tomatoes, it explains why he was interested in the preservation of food and food safety and health. It all has to do with his concern about people and their well-being. So in that text, he suggested creating social welfare programs, and it wasn't crazy that he was on a pulpit of sorts, on a soapbox, because he had long had the ear of some of the most important people in Europe, because of his established reputation as an incredible cook and a master of his craft. This is an example of that. He wrote this menu for the Duc d'Orléans and Princesse Hélène in 1898. They were famous customers of his. So, as I mentioned, he was extremely well established, and by the turn of the century, he was something of a brand. In 1906, he was hired by a German steamship company to design menus for their new ships. For the first ship's christening, he threw a gala, and the guest of honor was Kaiser Wilhelm II, who would lead Germany and Europe into World War I eventually. And the Kaiser was so impressed by his meal that he requested an audience with Escoffier. This was highly unusual. And this exchange that lasted probably a half hour is famous, and apparently he made the comment, "I'm the Emperor of Germany, but you're the Emperor of chefs." So Escoffier saw an opportunity here. He was, by this time, pretty at ease interacting with the most powerful people. And he discussed his fear of imminent war in all of Europe. He had fought in the Franco-Prussian War. Well, not fought, he'd been a cook in the army. And he was afraid that it was going to happen all over again, and that Europe was going to fall into dire times. And his exchange didn't prevent war, but when war did happen, he set up a rescue committee that allocated financial aid to the women and children of his cooks who had been mobilized or killed. Not content to just write about social welfare, he created the first mutual aid association for cooks. This was when he was working in Great Britain in 1903, and he conceived of some of the first charity dinners ever to support this project. This series of dinners was called the Dîner d'Épicure, and they took place at numerous restaurants around the world. By the time that he was doing them, many of his friends had moved on to other restaurants, many of the people that had worked underneath him. And they would serve one menu at the same time all around the world, written by him. The last one was in 1914 and had 10,000 guests in 147 cities. So it was no small feat. It actually, raised quite a bit of money. All right, so why is there a picture of Guy Fieri in a slide about Escoffier? It all goes back to our initial question, why do you care? Just yesterday, I read that Guy Fieri had raised $21 million for the unemployed restaurant workers. I just spoke about the charitable dinners that Escoffier had begun organizing. This seems very much in keeping with what Guy Fieri has been up to. So Escoffier did two things. The first is that he revolutionized French cuisine, and cuisine in much of Western society. It is what it is today because of him. He elevated the reputation of French cuisine on a world scale, and this elevated the job to one that was an art form and respected. And he used this respect to unleash social change, and he had the ability. He gave the ability to others to ascend to his status and to do the same. So, if Guy Fieri has a pulpit and is able to raise millions and millions of dollars for the needy during this hard time, it might be because of Escoffier and the work that he did. So without Guy Fieri, there wouldn't be any Flavor Town, and Chef Guy probably wouldn't have come up with the idea to use his clout to raise money for the needy. Remember those canned tomatoes that Escoffier invented? His main reason was that he was interested in food preservation, and because he had a healthy interest in food scarcity. It wasn't because he was interested in, the most astonishing food. It was because he wanted to make sure that everyone was fed. This was a theme throughout his career. People seem to think that it was his interest in food preservation was a commercial one, and really behind the scenes, it had a lot to do with his experience with food scarcity, fighting the Prussians during the Franco-Prussian War. He learned about how harsh it can be when there's a scarcity of food, and throughout his career, he looked for ways to save food and make sure that food was available to everyone. So in that same vein, he published in 1927 this booklet. It was a series called La Vie à Bon Marché. And it's a simple book of recipes where he introduces rice as a staple. Rice hadn't exactly been adopted by the French. And he cited studies of his that of countries all over the world that subsist on it, which is also quite unusual. A French chef looking outside of France was very unusual at the time. And it was because he wanted to find other staple foods for the French that they could maybe not eat luxuriously with, but that they could subsist on. He was also known for, when he was working in London, for his practice of saving choice leftover food to give to nuns who could redistribute it to the hungry. This was completely unprecedented at the time. He was even made fun of. And it sounds really simple, but it was only in 2016 that France banned supermarkets from discarding unsold food. So he was really ahead of his time in his concerns. This little volume is extremely difficult to find a copy of. It's been out of print for years, which is too bad, but it's because it wasn't a particularly complicated cookbook. It just served a purpose. I was definitely trying to get your attention when I showed you a picture of Guy Fieri, but I had a serious goal in doing that, which was to talk about how he was using a reputation that Escoffier had given him. Escoffier earned himself a reputation, a pulpit, and they used organic solutions for social problems, just like Guy Fieri is doing today in this pandemic. As cooks often do, he came up from the bottom. So these are two other chefs. Jose Andres came to this country with $50 in his pocket, and nevertheless, he worked his way up to the top, and now has an audience. And he's, like Escoffier did, leveraging his celebrity and his position of power to do good for a needy community, people that are hungry. It's sort of a rebellious theme that has existed for quite some time, with cooks, and some of these cooks offer real solutions to problems that circumvent the obstructions of working within the system. They've kind of always been outside of the system, and they see other ways and other avenues to affect change. They also come from oftentimes places that aren't privileged, so they identify with those that still need help. A favorite anecdote that I've saved is that when the Titanic sank, Escoffier had written the menus for its meals. He wasn't on the ship, and he was horrified. He was horrified by the tragedy and the loss, and he was most horrified that the crew wasn't taken care of, and that the families left behind by the crew, the cooks and the deckhands and everything else, weren't looked after. So what did he do? He organized a fund for these people, and he was the only person talking about this sort of issue, and not only talking about it, but then offering a solution and setting an example for others to emulate. He was the first of his kind, and he ushered in a new era of cooks that have a relationship with the public that can, in an ideal situation, foster a lot of good. The second picture is of Alice Waters, and she's known for trying to educate people about eating well. I'm also reminded, kind of as we see the world falling apart, or so it seems, of his discussion of unifying Europe before World War I. I wonder what would have happened if Europe had come together and not had World War I.
Merci Nolin, c'était vraiment fascinant.
So I think we can, Nolin, you would be happy to answer some questions from the public. So if anyone would like to ask a question, please either you can unmute yourself and ask the question directly, or if you would like to send a question via the chat, please do so as well, and I can read it out. Just please feel free to go ahead and ask Nolin whatever question. We have a question from Margarita in the chat. What kind of socioeconomic status did he come from?
That's great. He graduated from school around 14, and he started working at 14. So he was mostly self-taught. He knew how to read and write, but not especially well. And he becomes a better writer as he practices it. His dad owned a forge in southern France. So he wasn't extremely poor, but he was not super well off either.
We have a question from Patrick. To what extent has there been an interprofessional debate about the proper role of the chef, those who argue against taking political stances? I don't get the sense there's been much pushback against people like Jamie Oliver. So yeah, what's the code of ethics perhaps, or what are the debates about whether chefs should take public stands on social issues?
I think that's a great question, and I don't know that there's one succinct answer. There's definitely pushback. I've noticed, during the MAGA campaign, a lot of chefs discussing that, typically not in favor of the Trump election, and people going, shut up, you're a cook, as a response, stay out of politics. But anyone's entitled to voice their opinion, and they definitely were using their pulpit. The other thing is that, you know, this industry has been hit the hardest, or among, you know, besides the folks like nurses and doctors. So of course they should be talking about these things. As far as the code of ethics, there isn't one. It's the code of being a decent human. And to be fair, there's a lot of chefs that are schmucks. There's plenty that don't do the right thing. You know, the Me Too movement has really aired a lot of dirty laundry that needed to come out. So it's not like chefs are all perfect. In fact, quite the opposite. But the ones that do use their position, it's great. They have an ability to talk to people that is not necessarily you know, elitist. They've often come from different backgrounds, and yeah, I think I have answered that. Does that answer your question?
Sure. Thanks, Nolan.
So we have another question from, sorry. We had a question from Seth. Yeah, what dishes was he most known for? And then another one from Margarita. Did he live a long life? Did he live a healthy life? And did he work throughout his life?
He did. He was actively working for 50 years, which is unheard of. And he continued to read and write until he died. So he was churning out material for years. Probably his most famous dish was Peach's Melba. Let's see, drawing a blank here. Like I said in the presentation, he liked to name dishes after people, and they would often be slightly modified versions of things that had existed before. He really enjoyed, when he was working in England, serving English people frogs, which he called cuisse de nymphe, nymph's legs, to kind of obscure what they were. And people loved them as long as they didn't know what they were. So he was famous for that. I'm drawing a blank though on other things that might be household names. Speaking of household names, that was kind of one of the things that distinguished him. He was a household name in France, in Germany, in England, and even in the United States by the turn of the century. And he went on to live another 35 years. So for those 35 years, he was known throughout Western Europe and even the United States. He also was showing up in the States somewhat regularly, he and his business partner, Caesar Ritz, and setting up restaurants here in the States as well, helping consult. Okay, answer. Yeah. I guess the other thing I should mention too is how far-reaching his influence was, just as far as having taught students, people who worked under him. It's said that he had, during his career, 2,000 people that worked under him and then would go off to, you know, open their own restaurants or work at a high level in other places. It's kind of a mark of excellence if you had worked under him. Yes, Joe, you're muted though.
Yes. Hi. Well, thank you so much for all this information. So I found it really interesting that in one of the books you showed is actually thanking some chefs, you know, and he mentions Carême, who came before him, right? And so I think it's really interesting how he has a good understanding, not just of cooking, but also of the history of chefs, right? And it seemed to be like so much ahead of his time. I mean, on one hand, he comes from the tradition of, you know, starting early. I mean, it's my understanding, at least, that chefs who started as cooks, you know, in the whole hierarchy of cooking, really didn't live a long life because, you know, they were exposed to so much toxic stuff when they were cooking. But on the other hand, so he lived this long life, and he's ahead of his time by almost, you can link him to like sustainability, to local fresh food, to diet, I mean, healthy meds, and even, these mutual aid societies that, that are coming out again these days around food, around community gardens, around retrieving traditional local herbs and staples. It's amazing that he was well known, but he's a lot forgotten. Am I correct about that?
Yeah, it sounds like you've done your own research. He definitely was ahead of his time in so many ways, and that's kind of what what prompted me to keep poking around, because people talk about how he was a master chef, but then they neglect all of the other components. Especially some of the political stuff. Where he talks about how socialism is a good idea, and it might not be such an accident that that's been suppressed a little bit. But what I noticed was that the amount of information about him was always overwhelming and always impressive, both with regards to his cuisine, but then also with the other stuff that's a little bit more obscure. And I wanted to know why. And yeah, you're right. He looked to the past. He also looked to the future. He, as I mentioned with the rice cookbook, he also was looking to other countries even. And French cooks at the turn of the century were chauvinists typically. They weren't interested in other countries. They thought that they were the best. But that wasn't the case for him. So that's just another example of how open-minded he was. They often say that his move to have women showing up in his restaurants unaccompanied was just a business thing, but it seems to me like it had there was more to it than that. It was his strong sense of egalitarianism, but there's doesn't seem to be, at least, anything that's been written or recorded with his motivations behind that move. But he certainly was able to push that through, and that's also useful. Because his guests were the people that were able to change those things. In London, he was talking to the politicians. He knew Winston Churchill, and so they saw the sense in being able to eat on Sunday. It made sense. They wanted to go to the opera and then eat one of his a la carte menus, and so he was able to get on his soapbox and actually do something with it. Yeah, I think that's a little bit of an answer, but there's so many other answers to what you said.
No, just to maybe just ask a quick follow-up question about that. So you said that at this point, French French chefs were chauvinistic and not open to looking to other cultures for what might be, borrowed. But it seems to me that people make that criticism about French cuisine today as well, that it's somewhat traditional and that hasn't embraced fusion compared to American style of cuisine. So I guess I'm wondering, did he, so he had the book on rice, but did he actually use rice or ingredients that associated with other cultures in the meals that he would make in his restaurants that he would serve, or was it more that that was something that he was interested in the cookbooks, but not something that he would present in front of Winston Churchill or wherever it might be?
That's a good question. So the rice cookbook was after he retired. So he was working maybe as a consultant at the time and doing a lot of writing. And his trajectory was one from being not educated to being somewhat enlightened. So to the best of my knowledge, he wasn't really looking to other countries besides, European ones. He definitely did adopt Russian cuisine. He definitely had Russian dishes, which, was definitely looking to other places. But as far as going to, Asia or North Africa to look for cooking, I can't really speak to that. I haven't seen any evidence of that. But he certainly was able to recognize the wisdom in adopting their use of rice. If rice is the example that we're going with, he was open-minded enough to do that. And for the time, it was something. Because you're right, French cooks are considered chauvinists to this day. French cuisine has a lot of traces of that, but there's no evidence to me that he had chauvinism towards other countries. Quite the opposite, and that's as good as I can hope to answer your question, I think. But you're absolutely right. French cuisine remains chauvinistic. I can attest to that from firsthand experience, but not necessarily. There's plenty of people who actually very much embrace eating the foods of other cultures, sometimes to a point where it becomes kind of Orientalist in its approach. You know, they exotify the other cuisines. They seem to really exotify the Japanese, a reverence that's beyond what is appropriate. It's almost perverse. The Trois Gros brothers are famous. They were operating in the 70s for going to Japan and adopting fish techniques that were Japanese. By that I mean undercooking fish, or what French people might have called undercooking it, or not cooking it at all. And they're an example of the French reverence of cuisine, of other cuisines, of Japanese cuisine, before it became kind of strange. I hope I answered that question. I see, Patrick, you said, if there are no other questions, how hard is it to assemble a complete collection of his works? How far do you have left to go? Oh, I love this question. And I also see the question about preserving the books. So at this point, I have every book that was ever published by him, every cookbook, I should say, that's documented, with one exception. The sister of the rice book is a book about cooking cod, because he saw it as a great fish. It was considered a junk fish, and he wanted to have people using that because it's great to cook with. I haven't been able to get my hands on one, but as far as the other books that he's written, I have all of them at this point, and all of the editions as well. The Guide culinaire, his masterpiece, went through 4 editions with introductions that differ from one to the next, and revisions to the recipes. And I've managed to get my hands on all of those, which brings me to how I store them. I think a lot of book collectors see themselves as temporary owners, and so I feel that I need to make sure that they stay in as good of condition, if not in improved condition. So that copy of the Guide culinaire that I tracked down, which is super important, I've kept in a box that's special for that. It has special acid-free paper that absorbs acid from the book. At some point, I plan to get it to a person that will help me restore it in a way that's not aggressive, to prevent any more decay. For me, that's a book that really should be in a museum, not in my ownership. But for now, it's mine. But there is an Escoffier museum in his hometown, and hopefully it'll go there one day. Let's see. Are there any other questions? Did I answer the previous questions?
So I think there's a question from Patrick, right? Or was that a question?
I think I answered that. How hard? I mean, and I guess as far as how hard it is, it's pretty tricky. I'm also kind of good at it, and I've been privileged enough to be able to actually travel in person to France, which is a great way to. That's where you have to go to find stuff by him if you want obscure stuff. I have things mailed to my cousin in Paris sometimes, and she'll forward it to me. If the person isn't willing to ship it internationally. But it's not. It's because I'm fascinated by it, and I'm obsessive, and it's not easy. But it's certainly a pleasure. Juliette, you're muted.
Sorry. This is a fascinating talk, and it's also a Belle Epoque, which is one of my favorite eras from France. But I was wondering, have you attempted some of the recipes? Are they still, do you like making the food in these cookbooks? And if do you like making pêche melba? Or are there others that you think are better? Or just wondering what the actual recipes turn out like.
I love cooking French food. My mother's from France, so certainly yes, I have cooked from his books. I also like doing some of the old stuff, the old roasts. Do you remember the pictures from the beginning of the slideshow? Every once in a while, it's fun to do something ridiculous like that. But yes, I do. When you go to culinary school, the recipes are actually right out of his books. Sometimes unattributed, but they plagiarize freely when they give you a photocopied recipe to. I should say in France, culinary school, the recipes are right straight from him. And if you don't like French food, you probably won't like his stuff. But if you go to a fancy French restaurant and you like that, that's Escoffier. If you go to a more casual restaurant that's French and it's good, it's also Escoffier. Because towards the end of his career, he became, partially probably due to his concern for food scarcity, interested in more casual style dining, more housewives' cookery. And that was actually the topic of his last book. In 1935, he published a book called French Cuisine, and it was for both professionals and for home cooks, les ménagères. The translation isn't perfect, but it translates to housewives. And it was a melding of those two cuisines. So, when you eat in a brasserie, he was talking about how, regional French cuisine, not the highbrow stuff, was just, wonderful. He always talked about how his grandmother was the first person to cook for him and how her cuisine was great. In culinary journals that he was responsible for, he was the founder of a couple culinary journals. He would talk about regional cuisine, which is, necessarily not the highbrow stuff. And that's the kind of food that I like to eat. It gets a bad rep for being heavy sometimes. And when you eat in fancy restaurants, yeah, perhaps, you'll get a lot of butter, but the home style dining is lean meat. It's easy to eat. It's digestible, and it uses seasonal local produce. That's just a necessity when you're a housewife in the countryside. And that was, at the end of his life, that was his favorite thing to cook, and his favorite thing to serve, and his favorite thing to write about. Let's see. There's a question about the Titanic. Shall I read that out?
Yeah.
You wrote the menu on the Titanic. I saw the menus at the museum in Halifax in Nova Scotia some years back, and rice was definitely on the menu. But for the lower class, oatmeal and rice and beans for the third class passengers, to be exact. Not sure I understand the point you repeatedly make about Escoffier being egalitarian. Okay, I understand your point. It makes sense. The Titanic was not egalitarian. It was stratified. And the people at the bottom of the food chain were not the third class passengers. It was the workers, the kitchen hands. So they were even worse off. He was a product of his time. He was doing the best that he could. And if he was serving rice, it was because he wanted them to be fed well. And because he saw that as a way to do that in an economic manner. So an egalitarian, I think you could make the argument that he was an egalitarian by, while serving people rice. He certainly was looking after their best interests, and he, went as far as looking after the best interests of the people that perished even, when it certainly wasn't an expectation that anyone had of him. and it wasn't, strictly speaking, his responsibility. So I think he went above and beyond his responsibility with regards to the Titanic. Yeah. Do you disagree? I'm curious.
No, just that it's not my area of expertise. Okay, so maybe either Andrew or Juliette or Joel may answer that. But I think there is a colonial dimension to rice. I mean, it was not grown in France. As far as I know, it was grown in Asia. Okay, it was grown in the island, in the West Indies, etc. So maybe there was a business model, the colonies. He was trying to just promote. I'm not sure, but rice is definitely not something typically French even today. So my question is, did he have some connection with the colonial businessmen, stuff like that?
Not to the best of my knowledge. I don't know that he ever even traveled to any of the French colonies. You're entirely right. Rice is not French, and it remains not really French. What it was a great staple food, and I think that's the question that he was answering. I'm not sure that he was considering colonialism. And to the best of my knowledge, he never spoke on colonialism. I'm not sure that he was really aware of how disgusting colonialism is. And if he was, he did not write about it to the best of my knowledge. What I do know is that he was able to look to other cultures and see the best in them when he was given that view. But he was also working throughout his life. He worked 7 days a week. Even in retirement, he was keeping busy. And turning a blind eye to nasty things is not an excuse anymore. But I think that he was doing the best that he could. But I don't disagree with you, though. And I don't know that, I've seen nothing to indicate that his choice of using rice was motivated by his economic interests.
It's not an answer because I'm not a specialist, but certainly I wanted to ask you, where can I read this book on rice? But we talked a lot about this in my class about rice, and in various locations, like in Louisiana, where it came from. And in France, there is what's called le riz rouge that grows in Camargue. That is typical rice there. I think it's an old staple. But there are. When we were reading about rice, we learned that there were 70,000 species of rice, and different rices grew different places. So, I would be interested in knowing more about that. But certainly, it's a staple that came back to France also from the colonies. One imagine Vietnam, or it was, if it came probably from West Africa to Louisiana. Also, I'm not sure. We read a lot about, all the circulation of colonial staples and how, what changed, how each location changed through the circulation of that. But it's certainly an interesting idea to so early at the beginning of, you said you wrote it in beginning of 20th century, right? The book of
1928, as I recall.
Okay. So it's fascinating idea that like to know more about.
I might know where there's a PDF of that for you, Joel. But frankly, it's not that interesting except for the introduction. But I'll see what I can do to find you that. What you said also reminds me of the question about responsibility that came up earlier. A lot of cooks adopt cuisines that aren't their own, and lately a lot of people have been talking about how they need to acknowledge that they're cooking other countries. The optics of a white person, a white man. I'm thinking specifically of Rick Bayless cooking Mexican food and making lots of money, making it is not so great these days, and that wasn't really a question back when the rice cookbook that we've been talking about was written, and that question comes up again and again and again. A bunch of white cooks making food that is not is of the traditionally oppressed, and is that a sign of respect or is that a sign of disrespect? And it can be a sign of disrespect if you don't give credit where credit is due. If you start a restaurant and don't acknowledge that, traditionally the person that you are represents an oppressor, that's problematic.
So, it's just after 6 o'clock, and I understand that you can continue to hang out with us for a little bit. So if anyone would like to continue to talk with Nolin about his experiences or any other questions you have, please feel free. But otherwise, I'd just like to, thank you, Nolin, for a very stimulating and interesting talk and for a really rich question and answer session. Like I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else did too. And I want to thank everyone, students and staff and colleagues that attended as well. It was great that you could come today, and thank you very much. So so have a good evening, everyone. But if you want to stay on the Zoom for a little bit, then please feel free, and we can keep discussing a little bit.
You're welcome. It's been my pleasure. I'm sorry about the problems at the beginning there. Would love to answer any questions you have, and also should you have any other questions in the future, feel free to reach out to me. I'm sure that Joel or Andrew can provide you with my information. But yeah, if you guys have any other questions, let me know.
I guess I just wanted to, you said you worked at the Tour d'Argent, which is like, probably the most iconic French restaurant, and it's famous in the US because it shows like Iron Chef, right? And, whether or not it deserves it, I don't know if it's the best French restaurant today, but it's certainly, as I said, iconic. And so maybe you could, what was it like to work there? I mean, I guess for people, I feel this all the time, probably sick of answering this question, but it's still,
Well, remember when I said that some chefs are schmucks? I think that's a great example of a place like that. That's not to say that it doesn't have a lot of history. That's fascinating. That's why I went there. And I don't regret having worked there. I learned a lot. I got to see what kitchens can be and what they can be at their worst. It's one of the oldest restaurants in the world. It's one of the two oldest in Paris. Joel always reminds me that La Pérouse is probably older, but they both make that claim. It is iconic, and it serves the food that preceded Escoffier, and with some modernization too. They lost a star a few years ago, and they realized that finally it was time to maybe do a little reforming of their cuisine. But they're known for some kind of outrageous stuff. And their practices are also from before Escoffier, as far as the way that they treat their employees, as far as food waste goes, as far as hygiene goes, to be honest. There's a lot of questionable stuff going on behind the scenes. It's really expensive. I think some plates alone are 300 euros each. That's not for the meal. And I wouldn't let my family members eat there if I was given the choice. I can get into specifics. It's so hierarchical that that when a problem happens, no one addresses the problem because it's not strictly defined as their job. I remember once we ran out of dish soap, and we didn't have dish soap in the entire establishment for an entire week because the delivery hadn't arrived, and no one took it on themselves to go get dish soap, which they could have done, going across the street. If they wanted to, it would have been very easy. But then no one even told someone up the food chain that it needed to be dealt with because that wasn't their role. As far as abuse goes, there was sexism, there was homophobia, there was, you name it, it was there.
Yelling, lots of yelling and all that kind of stuff.
Lots of yelling, but even physical aggression. I remember watching a sous chef chasing after a young commis with a fork and spoon in his hands and going, you bastard, you bastard. I don't know what the commis had done, but it didn't come to blows, but it came close. I didn't stay there very long.
Speaking of La Pérouse, I noticed that one of the menus you showed, you made it for a friend, I think. You showed the menu and you made it at the restaurant La Pérouse.
Yeah, so that was the menu in honor of the French poet Jean Richepin.
Right.
It was one of the late dîners d'épicure, the dinners that he organized internationally. And La Pérouse was definitely one of the hosts. And that makes sense because of the two French restaurants in Paris that you would host a dinner at. If you were Escoffier, it wouldn't be La Tour d'Argent. It would be slightly superior La Pérouse, I would say.
Slightly, maybe, yeah. So you'll have to come back and then cook for us.
Avec plaisir.